All right, in this video, we are going to squash and stretch an object. In this case, the bouncing ball. This is a classic animation, so this will be fun. But a couple of things I want to point out before we begin the actual squash and stretch process. I'm going to zoom in on the ball so you can see it a little bit clearer. Before I started applying tweens and animating the ball, you'll see that the center point is down here at the very bottom. This is the first thing I did before in the very first keyframe. This is the first thing I did in the very first keyframe, is I used the free transform tool. By default, the center point was in the middle, okay? And I took that center point and I just simply dragged it down here to the very bottom. The reason I did that, as I'll show you, I've created a guide layer here, a nice little horizontal guide layer. And this is my point of contact for the ball. So as it gets down here, it reaches that point of contact. Okay, so let me zoom in a little bit here. And you can see how the ball hits that point of contact and stops, and then I motion tween it back up to its original position again. All right, so now this will come into play in a second when we actually start to apply the squash and stretch deformation of the ball. Now, before I do that, I want to create a few more keyframes to play with to actually apply this deformation at the bottom. So I'm going to hold down the Option key and click and drag this keyframe down here. And click and drag this. So to duplicate this keyframe, the easiest way is to hold down the Option key and then click and drag it. And you'll see I've just created a duplicate. Now I'm going to repeat this procedure a few more times, and until I've created about 5 or 6 different keyframes down here. You'll also notice that we actually ended up shortening the tween where the ball animates back up to its original position. So we want to insert a few more frames. I'm just going to click on a frame here anywhere within this tween and hit the F5 key a few times just to insert enough frames to make that tween span long enough. All right, so now our animation, you'll see the ball hits our point of contact, and because all these keyframes are the same, it just stays there, and then it travels back up. By the way, I have actually added a little bit of easing to these tweens to give it more of a natural sense of gravity. So you can see there's a little bit of easing in and then easing out. All right, so now let's get to the actual squash and stretch. So the one very important thing to remember about squash and stretch is that, like I said before, squash and stretch is a deformation of an object, okay? And that deformation can't possibly start to take place until after the object has actually hit its point of contact. So this second keyframe, we don't deform the ball at all. It's the keyframe after. And to deform the ball, I want to just use the free transform tool like this. I'm also going to turn on onion skin. And I just want to be able to see a frame or two behind the current keyframe. So this is fine. So, like I said, here we are in the keyframe after the point of contact. This is where we start the deformation of the ball. It actually starts to stretch. Now, as much as it stretches outward, it's also going to squash roughly the same amount. Because if it doesn't, if it just squashes in one direction or it just stretches in another direction, then you're actually changing the volume of the object. And that actually can't happen in the real world. So we want to mimic real physics as much as possible here. So I'm going to squash it about that much, maybe even a little bit more to exaggerate it. I'm going to turn off my Snap to Objects tool. And in the next frame, I'm going to squash it just a little bit more. Just about like that. All right, so now just going to jog through here just to get a sense of what's happening. And that looks pretty good. Now I want to start the opposite reaction, maybe something like this. So let's jog back and forth, scrub this timeline a little bit and see what happens. And that seems to work. Let's turn off onion skin. And one thing we might want to just be aware of as we play back this animation is that if it feels like the ball is maybe sticking to the point of contact a little too long, we can go into one of these keyframes and start to nudge it up using the up arrow key. Maybe turn on onion skin for this. So it rebounds a little bit quicker. And there you have it. That's a pretty good squash and stretch animation right there. It provides a little bit more life to the object. And again, squash and stretch is normally a traditional animation technique that's applied to characters, but it's also great for applying to things like flyout menus and UI elements if you're animating them for, say, a game. There's really an unlimited amount of use that you can get out of squash and stretch techniques. So have fun with it.